Greetings YouTube and welcome to the Blue Corner and to a Cardfight deck profile overview and discussion, and that is going to be on Dragonic Vanquisher with FULLBRONTO. I've got a proxied out deck here, although much like with the Night Rose profile, it won't be with real proxies because I didn't want to waste ink when I can't play the deck IRL, but we're using some older cards as substitutions, sparking, and yeah, I'm just going to go over the build I've got right now and talk about some other stuff I've seen in regards to this deck, and present options so that when this deck comes out in English, people have an idea of what they want to do with it. Because the one thing I've noticed with Vanquisher is that there has not been a 100% defined build of the deck right now. In fact, there's a couple variations of it floating around, and it just depends, I guess, on tastes and what you want to prioritize. Do you want to be more inclined towards the combo aspect, or do you want to play some cards that allow you to combat your opponent when you've gone second and they try and rush you down, so you want to punish them and whatnot? So yeah, basically Vanquisher this time around is a little more tricky to build and play than it was in the past. And that's saying something, because Vanquisher was not an easy deck to pilot before. Like, that's why decks like Revon saw more play, despite Vanquisher being considered to be the best deck of its format, is because with Revon, you could just turn sideways and go burr, whereas Vanquisher required a little more out of its pile to get max value of, and that kind of scares some people off. Like, if Narukami could be considered the equivalent of Yu-Gi-Oh's Thunder Dragon, then this deck here is probably closer to Danger Thunder Dragon in that it wants to draw and aggro, and at least with this build. So, and I'll get into why this one's a bit more like Danger Thunder than before. So anyway, about the deck, at least as far as the format goes, by the way, current starter is Sparky Dragoon. So, prior to the ban list coming in, this deck was the 4th best of the OCG format and the 2nd best Axel. Now that Yasui is coming in with its 4 Shiryuki, that may change. We'll have to see which one between Vanquisher and Yasui will ultimately win the day. There is merits to playing this deck over Yasui. I think our turn 3 is just a little bit stronger than theirs. They've got Shiryuki, but I think Vanquisher has a bit more oomph to its grade 3 push turn. Basically, it just comes down, are you able to resolve FULLBRONTO, whereas are they able to resolve Yasui? And I think FULLBRONTO, if you can apply that to the grade 3 turn of this deck, you can do a little more damage than that Yasui. The longer the game goes, though, they obviously can do more because they can generate more Axel circles consistently, and they can pump out more attackers consistently than we do. And that's all I really got to say about that. Anger Blader is still Anger Blader. It wants to go first, and it wants to high roll on its grade 3 and kill you. If it can't do that, then it dies. And I think we're going to see less of it now compared to back then, just because why would you play Anger Blader over Yasui, Vanquisher, and especially Gurglitz? So yeah, that's where this deck is currently sitting at. Overdress is coming on the horizon, and we'll probably get a new gimmick for ours. That will probably be what finally pushes Vanquisher out. I imagine that the blood will also not mesh well with this deck, so I will probably consider doing a profile on the blood, and probably that. Nothing for Eradicators though, because that deck's awful and not worth my time. Like, it's a shame too, because Descendant's a cool card and all, but like, that deck is just not good. And if you want to see a good Eradicator deck, then just take a look on my community page where my 0 profile is, because that's where you're gonna see Eradicators get played, is on 0. Anyway, so let's get into the actual profile itself and talk about some card choices that I am not playing or could be playing that you might want to consider playing. So for the grade 3s, the first point of contention will be 3 Dragonic Vanquisher. Now, this deck plays a high grade 3 count, and admittedly, OG Vanquisher is your ideal ride compared to, say, riding Bronto first, as riding Bronto and not having another one does feel pretty oof. Here's the thing I've noticed though, is that against the top decks or against good players, your opponent doesn't leave anything in the front row for you to bind with OG Vanquisher. Therefore, getting that 10k buff off becomes a little more tricky. You basically need to have 3 hand binders on your turn 3 in order to get that 10k off, versus riding Bronto and giving himself the 10k. At least he'll be a 22 swing, and you have the option of playing another Bronto down on top of that to enable your stuff. So really, they're both vanilla rides, except one is a little less vanilla. Going second, obviously Vanquisher would be better because you'll have things to kill, but basically what I'm saying is, in a scenario where you're drawing your grade 3s in multiples, drawing these two in pairs is nowhere near as bad as drawing this in pairs. And this deck plays a good amount of draw power, so you will get to this guy eventually. You could possibly draw into it off of your triggers, or the book, or Jaggy, or Rock Climb, or alternatively, you will probably search it off of your Chain Bolt or your Mighty Bolt, as both of the grade 3 ideal rides in this, grade 1 rides, I should say, in this deck, search your 3s. But yeah, not much to say here. Like, we know what Vanquisher does, we know what Jaggy Shot does, and Bronto, if you don't remember, is treated as Dragonic Vanquisher on Vanguard, and if it's bound from your hand during your turn, if you have a Dragonic Vanquisher Vanguard, discard 1, Superior, ride it, get your gift, at the end of the turn, ride a 3 from Soul, and don't get a gift, and when it's placed on Vanguard, your front row gets 10k. So, sometimes you'll have a 8k attacker that you threw up early because you wanted to poke your opponent in, and the Bronto could buff that up to 18 as well. Any one other bind, it's a 23 and a 22 swing, which is not awful. So yeah, that's that. And then the last grade 3 slot is being occupied by the book order. I don't own one of these things, as I never bothered to pick up Try 3 Next, and I just really haven't been that motivated to grab copies off of eBay or TCG Player just because it's Christmas time and I'm shopping for stuff. But so pretend that this Book of Moon is the book order. That being said, I know it's a weird flex. I'm using my Turbo Pack book, but these things look nice. Anyway, book order. So it's a grade 3 order that says Counterblast 3, Soul Blast 3, draw 3, choose 3 of your units, and they get 10k power until end of turn. Why am I playing that in this deck? Because this deck has Counterblast to spare for days. It's not playing Cho-Oh, so the only thing that counterblasts in here is Vanquisher. And the book is pretty good at allowing you to, well, combo harder, because it's the little things, really. So, like I said before, if you ride Vanquisher going first and your opponent has nothing to bind, it's essentially a vanilla. If you happen to have the book with it and your opponent somehow gave you 3 counterblasts, sometimes people just flip crits 2 turns in a row. It happens 0 enough. The book allows you to draw deeper into your deck so you can get to your extenders or your enablers, while also buffing up your units that can't be buffed up because you rode Bronto or Vanquisher or something and aren't able to give them power. So the book does that, and going second, the book also works because your opponent will probably try and aggro you down because your deck doesn't do anything until turn 3 unless you're playing Cho-Oh. So they'll give you 3 counterblasts or so, therefore you can ride the Vanquisher or the Bronto, book to draw into more cards, and push back, which is pretty good. And the book also has the added benefit of being searchable off of your Mighty Bolt Dragoon, which is pretty cool. As far as the number of books played is up in the air. I like the 1 for sure, and maybe I'll go to 2. It just depends if I want to cut the Rising Phoenix 4, as I've seen builds that play anywhere upwards to 3. I don't know if I would consider playing 3, but I do like playing them in here. That being said, book is not needed. Most of the Vanquisher lists that I've topped don't play book. It's just a card that came to my mind when I was theory crafting the deck with people, because like, oh wait, this deck doesn't counterblast very much. We could probably play the book and draw deep into our deck while also letting our units hit over triggers and whatnot. So it is an option, and that's pretty much it for the 3s. Then for the grade 2s, not much to say here. I'm just maxing out on the enablers and the extenders that you can play. So 4 Rock Climb, 4 Chatara, and 4 Voltec Shred. So North America does not have access to the promo Barca, which is on attack after battle, Soul Blast 1, Bind 1, Draw 1. Instead, though, we can just play Voltec Shred, who is arguably better for the role anyway because he's on attack bind from hand, which allows you to bind the Bronto, therefore give this guy the plus 10k on his battle, so he goes from being a 9k swing to a 19, which is great against your opponent's 9k Vanguard. Or you can make him 24 on XL2, which lets you hit over a defensive trigger, which is pretty good. Joshua we already know about, and the Rock Climb, if you don't remember, is after the battle that it attacked, if you have a Dragonic Vanquisher Vanguard, you can retire it to draw a card, and then you have the option to bind 1 from hand, to bind 1 of your opponent's front or rear guards. It's cool that they don't make it all one effect, so if need be, you can just swing, retire, draw, and leave it at that, so you have nothing in the front row for your opponent to attack, because you didn't bind something from hand, therefore it becomes harder for them to damage deny you. Not that this deck can really be damage denied again. aside from book, it's just Vanquisher, so you can work with one counterblast. But in any case, the fact that this guy gets his effect off by just attacking anything, not just Vanguard, means that if your opponent hits a defensive trigger off of one of your other swings, you can just go after a rear guard, retire him, draw your card, and then bind something, and then do your stuff. And the fact that Rock Climb retires itself is also pretty cool, because you can just slap him on your XL2, attack, retire, draw, and then bind Chatra and call it over that XL2, and now he becomes a 23 or 33, depending on what else you're at in the turn. It's just the little interactions like that. Then for the grade 1s, I'm playing a much lower count of 9. So we're playing the 4 Chain Bolt, the 4 Mighty Bolt, and finally the 1 Rising Phoenix. So the number of grade 1s in this deck is a bit up in the air. Some people like 10 with 2 Rising Phoenix. Builds I've seen play an average of 8 to 9 with either 1 Rising Phoenix or no Rising Phoenix. And honestly, I think I'm leaning more towards the 8 card count myself, as the majority of lists I've seen that are winning are playing about 8 grade 1s. But then you get the one build that comes up with like 2 or 3 Phoenixes, and you go, I don't know about that anymore. So it's a wild time for this deck. But in any case, so basically the idea is that most of the grade 1s in Narukami suck, so we're just playing the good ones. You've got Phoenix, who we all know what he does. And even at just 1 copy, it's still usable, because a Phoenix you draw at any point in the game will eventually be live against decks that you can make it live against. That being said, against decks you can make it live against, Gurgowitz and Gavriel don't leave anything in the front row for you to pick off if they can help it. Therefore, Rising Phoenix doesn't get many opportunities to come out and attack. Luard's a different story, and I can't remember how often Yasui leaves its front row open. I think they can still play the Mirage game, so against like weaker decks, then yes, you'll get Phoenix off. So that's why I think one of the reasons why people are playing less copies of Phoenix. The other thing about Phoenix is that it isn't a card that enables your binds or benefits from being bound itself, whereas all the other cards in this deck, aside from Phoenix, work off of either binding a card from hand, or they are a card that can be bound from hand. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind. If you need to play more extenders or enablers, then you can cut the bird. And then as for the other cards, this search is grade 3s. This search is grade 3s on Ride, and it's also an extender. Yeah, not much to really comment in regards to the grade 1s. Don't be surprised if Phoenix just gets cut more and more frequently from lists. Then for the triggers, I'm playing the 6 draws and 6 crits. It's just what kind I'm playing that's different. So I'm playing 2 Sentinel crits, and then 2 Sentinel draws alongside the 6 vanilla draws. So the idea behind this is that we're at the point where a lot of swings are just getting to the point where it's either PG or take them, or PG or throw many cards down to not take them. And sometimes you don't want to be PGing off your non-triggers or even some of your other triggers. So what do? Well, that's where the 30k shields come in. Gurgut's rearguard lanes, at least their Axel attackers, hit about 37 or 39. You can block that with just 1 Sentinel crit instead of having to throw a PG away, or having to throw this and this, or this and a heal. So every now and then, being able to just guard with 1 card is really good for a deck like this that needs to hold on to as many cards in his hand as possible. And yeah, that's all I really gotta say here. Like, this is based off of the builds that are playing 6 crit, 6 draw, and also the builds that are playing 7 draw, 5 crits with 1 Sentinel crit. And I figured, you know what? Let's see how 2 of each trigger type work. And then finally, 4 heals. And that's all I gotta say about that. Now, as far as other options in the deck, as you might not have noticed, I'm not playing Cho-Oh. In addition to that, I'm also not playing fronts. So, fronts, basically, and this is one of the worst reasonings possible for this, but when I play fronts, I don't see them. Like, I legitimately just never really see them as much as I do with crits or draws. It's just, for some reason, whenever I play fronts, the only time I'll ever see them are when they're in my hand. And I know, like I just said, silly reasoning, but I swear to God, like, playing crits in the deck work better for me. Secondly, if you're playing a build that plays the book, then crits just work better because you're already giving your front row power with the book. So playing fronts just seems kind of silly on top of that. In addition to that, I also feel if you play a strictly front build, your opponent could just no-guard your attacks and at least your Vanguard swings and not get punished for it because they're only taking like a damage or so. And this build, since it's playing less copies of Phoenix, doesn't really deploy as many Axel attackers in a turn as, say, Yasui can, so fronts just don't really work as well. If you were to play, say, 3 Rising Phoenix in your deck, then yes, consider fronts, because Phoenix benefits with fronts. And as far as Cho-Oh goes, it just comes down to this build is more geared towards trying to combo harder and going first, as opposed to playing less combo cards and playing more going second cards. And it's just, unfortunately, going second against the top decks with this deck is already going to be a struggle that I don't think playing Cho-Oh will really change a lot in punishing your opponent for trying to do that. If anything, them trying to aggro me what the hell? Them trying to aggro me super early means that I'll have the counterblast for the book, which allows me to draw more cards to clap them back. So that's all I really got to say in regards to those. And then I think that's pretty much all the noteworthy cards. So that's the deck in a nutshell. All in all, Vanquisher is a pretty solid and competitive deck. It's just, unfortunately, it's outclassed by Gurgwit, and well, they aren't doing another ban list till about February, so it's going to be a pretty long wait until that beast is addressed. And then there's also the issue of, well, Overchest on the horizon. That being said, though, the deck seems to be a solid pickup, and I imagine it'll be reasonably inexpensive too because of, well, Gurgwit and Gabriel running the show. So you can honestly pick up the Vanquisher deck for not a lot and just add it to your already existing Vanquisher deck and go from there, and you'll have a pretty solid and honestly technical deck to play. Like, I know Standard gets a lot of flack for the amount of degenerate mindless decks that are running around, and rightfully so, but Vanquisher is probably one of the more big brain decks in the format, just because getting the most out of your attack chains, or just getting the best attack chain, does require a good amount of thought put into how you structure your plays, and misplaying obviously can punish you, which is why in the past decks like Revon saw more play than they probably would have, at least as far as Japan went, because why play a deck like Vanquisher that requires you to think a bit in order to do stuff when you just go Revon Burr and slam face with its attacks. Like, that's kind of what happened over here. Was like, despite being considered the best deck in the format, Vanquisher didn't get the number of tops to back it up, at least in the online format, just because Revon was a much easier deck to play. And yeah, that's kind of the case here too. Like, Vanquisher exists, but they're easier, in this case, stronger decks to play, like Gurgwit. But anyway, deck is a load of fun, and the cards coming out of the set also work with the already existing Standard Plus version of the deck. Now, admittedly, the best premium deck for ours is still going to be the vanilla beatdown deck that you've seen on a couple channels, but this is still a pretty solid deck that I'm looking forward to playing in premium as well. And then as far as what's on the horizon for the clan, we got the Blood coming, but he'll be his own deck, I'm sure. And then finally Overdress, which will probably introduce a new gimmick for Narukami. That being said, I'm still hoping that whatever gimmick we get will work with Vanquisher to an extent. More hand binding, or just binding in general. Bushiroad's done a good job of carving out an identity for Narukami in the reboot, and I'm hoping that this new series continues to expand on what Narukami has in here. Stick to bind, stick to front row binding, no thunder striking, and yeah, more cards that benefit from being bound from hand, or more cards that bind from hand. Ideally on turn 2 would be nice, so I can have an early game, please? Well, we'll find out. Anyway, that's all I gotta say about this. Comment down below on what you're doing here, Vanquishers. If you have any questions about this deck, or just more Narukami questions in general, ask them down below as well. They'll be answered in the Q&A video that will be coming out in due time. And that's all I gotta say. So until next time, this is BlueStar899, jacking out.